Again, Jason Jones. I'm from Des Moines, Iowa originally. I have spent the last 8 years working for an organization called the Homestead. The Homestead is actually a human services organization. We help people with autism, and one of the ways that we do that is through the farm that we run. We have, our parcel is 80 acres. Most of that's cash rented out to a conventional no-till corn and bean farmer. And then we use about 8 acres for producing fruit and vegetable crops for our CSA. We have about 100-member CSA that we grow for, and then we also grow an acre of apples. So this is a lot different than what we've talked about this morning. But I just wanted to come and kind of give you some examples of what I've done in the past with cover crops and maybe give you some ideas as to how to use them a little bit differently than what we conventionally think of when we're talking about them. So over the last 8 years, I've used quite a few different types of cover crops with varying degrees of success. I do have some favorites, which include winter rye, buckwheat. Hairy vetch is a great cover crop to pair with winter rye. It does really well. Lots of nitrogen fixation going on with those, and then white clover. So this is an example of our use of white clover. These areas that are fairly bare there were strawberry crops. I grow everything on raised beds using plastic culture. This field was prepared early in spring. Plastic laid down, cover crop put down, and then this picture I think is in maybe early June or mid-June. Plastic's been pulled off to let the strawberries continue growing, and then the white clover is just managed by mowing in between those rows. Here's an example of what it looks like after a couple years. This is third year strawberry production on the same bed. The white clover has filled in really nicely. It's actually starting to encroach on the strawberry beds a little bit. That's a problem with white clover. It'll grow into whatever you're working with. Although it's fairly easily managed. If you can rip it out, then it won't grow, obviously. So what I do is I use a 6-foot wide bush hog mower to kind of come down. I just kind of put it flat against the ground. And since these raised beds have a crowned top, I can come along the edge with the side edge of the mower and just kind of rip all of that white clover off, and that gives bare soil for the strawberries to kind of grow out and also prevents the clover from getting too far into those strawberries. Left alone, that clover will overtake those strawberry beds with no problem within a year. So you do have to be mindful of how you're managing that crop. This is an example of oats and berseem between beds of black plastic. It was laid down right after the beds were prepared, early spring. I think this is a field that has parsley and basil and whatnot in it. And you can see it's got pretty good coverage. There's a few bare spots, but overall it works really, really well for that purpose. I'm getting soil holding going on, getting some nitrogen fixation. But my main goal there was to keep the soil in place for when it rains quite heavily. Most of these fields are on a slight slope, not too much, maybe 2%. Another example of the oats and berseem, and I show this picture just to that lettuce in the foreground. It doesn't look that bad because I'm that bad at growing it. It's because we just had a hailstorm the night before. So it's just an example of how well, even when you've got heavy hail come down dislodging soil, it's still pretty much holding it in place. So a good example of why it's important to have those there. This is an example of a success that I've had with cover cropping. This was probably maybe 2008 or 2009. Winter rye and hairy vetch was seeded into the fall, just laid on top of the soil in the fall, and it grew. Early spring, maybe 2 or 3 weeks prior to this picture, I went through with that bush hog mower and just mowed out strips, and then followed behind that with a rototiller, one pass, just to kind of chop it up and incorporate it. And then I think either the same day or right after that, I went through and then laid the plastic down in there. And then the rye underneath the plastic goes away a little bit faster than the stuff on the sides. And then I've left this crop standing to get it to the point where I can kill it without having to worry about it coming back. Winter rye, you have to kill at the soft dough stage, which is right as the seed is starting to form. And then I've also increased the total amount of biomass that I have to leave on the soil as a cover and, you know, food for microorganisms or whatnot. That system worked really well. I was pleased with that.
So what happened to the hairy vetch then? Did that, I mean, you killed the winter rye. Did you have a problem then with the hairy vetch?
No. They start to flower around the same time. So, and then what I would do if I did, I would just go through, I've got enough space. This system is spread out. I mean, most people aren't going to grow tomatoes like this because they want their beds to be a little bit closer together, but I was able to go through and mow off anything that had. Now, from this same planting, this field still has hairy vetch that'll pop up every once in a while. It's not a weed in the sense that, you know, it's going to hamper your production necessarily, but it is possible for it to just kind of keep going, and then you always have this little problem out there. And you can see the rye did a lot better than the hairy vetch. I like the way hairy vetch looks. I like what it does. It's super expensive seed, and I just caution against using it because of that. And then this is an example of, in the red circle here is just an example of rye that's kind of gotten away from the previous year. This is a potato field. And then, so it was tilled up and prepared, and then, you know, you've just got a couple plants. You guys all know how many seeds one rye plant or one anything plant can produce. So just as an example of how one plant can kind of start to create a bigger problem later on, if it gets out of control. Now we can just go through there with a hand hoe and take care of them, but if you didn't, then you'd have more problems next year. So this is an example of two fields that are right next to each other. After I think what I had decided was this was June of 2011. I think we had 13 inches of rain in June of 2011 in central Iowa, and you know, there was this cover crop seeded here. It was further behind than this one, but you can see how much good it did to have a cover crop seeded on that side at that time, which is none really. So, and the other crop was seeded probably a month beforehand. So good coverage. There wasn't much erosion away from the soil in between those beds at that time, but over on the right there was quite a bit. An example of volunteer cover crops. We mulched this allium field with wheat straw, and then had subsequent growth of wheat cover crop, which I kind of just left it there to grow, and then killed it before it could go to do any seeding. But it was, you know, things like that aren't going to hurt anything. They're adding benefit to the soil and adding cover. So it was a nice addition. I haven't done a lot. That was the only time that I've had any experience with growing wheat. So it's a nice crop to see. It's kind of short, and I think the residue decomposes rapidly. So it's a good choice. This is an example of what not to do with cover crops once you've got them established. You can see over here to the left, really good establishment of, I think this is a white clover that's been established in there, and Berseem clover, because there are melons that are going in. So we had a heavy rain the morning that we were going out to plant. We needed to get out and plant, but you can see the damage that we're doing to that cover crop. It's not going to provide a whole lot of benefit, especially compared to the place that we'd already planted and then seeded. So that is just an example of how careful you need to be once the plant has just gotten started, because you can really do some damage to it and then offset any of those gains that you would have gotten otherwise. And then there's always covering the soil without a cover crop. These are just tomatoes mulched with leaves, which is another way to do it on a small scale. And then the warning for everyone that's considering using cover crops: be prepared. Know what your crop's going to do. Know what can happen. This is a winter squash field that had a cover crop planted into it that I was kind of just waiting to see if the cover crop would, do something more than I knew that it was going to do, and then waited too long and ended up losing that winter squash field because I was relying on the cover crop to do something that it just couldn't do. And I don't remember exactly why, if it was just poor establishment or just poor management on my part. It was probably the latter. And then this is an example of what my cover cropping scheme would look like for carrots. It's, basically, in my opinion, especially for fruit and vegetable farmers in Iowa, one of the things that we have to do if we want to use cover crops, which I think is vitally important, we kind of have to just go back to the way things were. We have to move into longer rotations. We have to take more time and hopefully build up the soil a little bit better. The other reason I have this on here, it reminded me to talk about an example that a trial that I did with PFI a couple years ago. We were testing out the biofumigant properties of mustard on carrot production. So in the fall, we made our carrot beds, seeded them out with a push seeder with some mustard, and then that mustard winter killed, and then the following spring went and planted carrots in those rows. This is all anecdotal. I don't have any data that talks about this, but in those areas where the mustard was planted and had died or had winter killed, there was no significant weed growth at all. The areas in between those rows, it was normal weed pressure that we would get. And then in the areas, the random replicated trial, so in the areas where the mustard was planted, carrot germination and carrot growth was a lot better. Although, as I told the previous group, I'm not a very good carrot grower, so I don't have numbers that say it was, we did 10 pounds more carrots per square foot or 100 square feet or whatever it was. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Do I have any questions from anyone?
Are you rotating out your potatoes? You're doing potatoes, and then oat vetch, and then the following year, do you move your potatoes to a different location?
Right.
You don't count on the oat vetch to have a disease suppressant.
So at the end of this here, we're coming up here. I didn't put this to the side. These are for spring. The top row is for spring planted carrots, and the bottom row is for fall planted carrots. So it's either a half-acre section of each or a half-acre section split into two. So it would just follow around. But that would, of the crops that I want to grow, it should.
Extended rotation.
Exactly. I would say, just make sure if you're going to advise people to use cover crops, like Tom was saying earlier, make sure you've got the right equipment to either put it in and kill it, and think about it in terms of a whole nother cropping system in addition to the one that you're doing. It's not just something that you're throwing in to try and add a little bit of benefit. I think that you have to kind of look at it as part of the long-term goals, which with corn and soybean, it makes it a lot harder. You got fewer choices than I do as a vegetable grower, but the benefits are definitely there for both.